Previously on the road to 9.
Yeah, okay.
Is it too cozy?
No, I don't think it's too cozy. Like, I mean, we are in a giant, brick warehouse, and you managed to make it cozy.
With episode 9 approaching, Star Wars fans are facing a definite ending for the first time in a long time. So how do we prepare? Well, one way is denial, but the other is to rewatch the entire Skywalker saga in preparation for the end of an era.
Whoa!
The Star Wars Watch Order conversation has been raging since the prequels came out 20-ish years ago. Back then, the issue was simply, which trilogy do you watch first? The one that starts with the first movie? Or the one that starts with the other first movie?
Thanks for joining us for the second episode of The Road to 9. Today we are talking about the most appropriate or best or worst viewing order for watching Star Wars in the lead up to the Rise of Skywalker. And we are joined by our friend, producer and author, Adam Lance. What is your preferred watch order? If you're going to go back and start from scratch right before and try and get things finished right before the Rise of Skywalker, where are you going to begin and where are you going to end?
That's actually, I have two answers for that. So my first answer is my preferred order is starting with Rogue One, A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Revenge of the Sith, then Return of the Jedi, then Force Awakens, and Last Jedi. That's my preferred order. That's the neatest version of the story that I find, just because it all flows together. The reveal of Vader, then accompanied by just directly going into his fall, works really well. And then it helps explain why Vader is a little out of character in Return of the Jedi, and also beyond that, it leads straight into the sequel trilogy. That's my preferred order. However, I've done this very recently. I did the entire chronological order, which is starting with Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, Solo, Rogue One, and then straight on through. I think right before episode 9, I'm going to do another chronological order, just because I'm curious to see how the Rise of Skywalker builds all that together as a 9-movie series. So yeah, those are my two orders that I would do.
In the past 4 years, the conversation has become more complicated, with the addition of new main saga movies, 2 spin-off movies, and an unending expanded universe that is officially part of the canon. Blue Bantha Milk Co. is not immune to this confusion, and even between your 2 favourite Star Wars aficionados, there has been some debate over the subject. Matt previously shared a watch order that started with Solo, and then moved through the story chronologically from there. The prequels were optional, or they could sit between the original and sequel trilogies to fill in the gaps, but it was difficult to choose exactly where to put them. This watch order had the Jedi initially take a back seat, while characters like Maul and Vader appear with little context, but they still make big impacts. It paints a picture of the trials, wars, and travails between the Rebellion and the Empire, establishing the galaxy far, far away that the Skywalker saga later fills in. Starting with Solo and Rogue One positions the Rebellion as the main conflict of the movies, rather than beginning with the Force-focused and mythology-heavy prequels.
When you were going through the chronological order most recently, Did you add in any kind of ancillary material, or did you just stick to the films?
I just stuck to the films. There's a lot of, obviously I could have done Clone Wars or Rebels in there, and unfortunately haven't had a chance to watch Resistance yet. But I just mostly stayed to the live action films just for a cleaner watch. And also, I only had a week. My girlfriend was away for a week, and I wanted to just do this thing, so I couldn't do the entire thing. That's what I do when my girlfriend's away. I just watch Star Wars, which is never off-brand for me, if anyone's been following me on Twitter.
Yeah, you've been counting down. Let's see. So you started off obviously with the countdown to the rise of, it was the countdown to episode 9.
Yeah.
How many days was that when you started?
I honestly have no idea. So for those who don't know, we're one day closer to seeing the Star Wars, the episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, every day for months now. I don't know exactly when I started. The story behind that, very briefly, is I was having a down day. I was kind of sad, but I was like, you know what? Hey, I'm one day closer to seeing Star Wars episode 9. That's amazing. So I tweeted that and I wrote it on Facebook. And one of my friends said, if you do this every day, I'm going to kill you. So I said, haha, I'm taking on that challenge. And I've been doing it every day, nonstop, with mistakes every so often. But I haven't missed a day yet. No, that's incorrect. I've missed one day, and I think it was like my third day that I missed. Yeah, I just keep on doing it because it's like, you know, it makes me happy, and it seems to make other people happy. And the coolest moment was when someone from Lucasfilm at Star Wars Celebration is like, oh yeah, hey, yeah, we're one day closer to seeing Star Wars Episode 9. I'm like, yeah, that's me. So yeah, I've been doing that every day for probably far too long.
I think that was actually how I came across you. So, you know,
Really?
Obviously, Twitter is a bit of a minefield. I mean,
A little bit.
for anyone that's never
understatement.
been on Twitter, it's a minefield, just so you know. But, you know, you're probably one of the brighter voices out there. You know, I mean, there are some people that like to get really bogged down into fights and, you know, negativity and stuff like that, even when they're trying not to. But, you know, you take a very objective approach to all of the interactions that you seem to have on Twitter, at least the ones that I see.
Yeah.
And yeah, seeing you posting that every day, it's been kind of a nice little beacon to sort of wake up to. So, you know, I wake up in the morning and I roll out of bed and it's like, Twitter, what's going on here? And I can pretty much count on seeing one of yours. Usually has a 7-hour delay.
I appreciate that though. No, to your point, like I would tend to get I was getting into a lot of fights on Twitter, and just like everyone else was at post Last Jedi, you know, I don't think that the fandom is as big as the fandom menace like say it is, especially having been at Celebration. I really think that those people who are angriest are smaller and louder, but it's easy to fall into that sort of let's fight about everything, let's just nitpick. But what I decided to do was it's like you really can't convince them. You can't convince someone that their opinion on a subjective media is wrong, but you can. No. There's no such thing as an objectively good movie or objectively bad movie. I love The Room. It's a terrible film, but it's one of my favorite films.
It's fantastic.
It's fantastic. It's so bad, but it's so good. And I think that The Last Jedi is a very, very good film, and a lot of the things that really make me love Star Wars is in The Last Jedi. To my mind, it's a better understanding of Star Wars than a lot of the sort of fans think it is. I love that it doesn't play it safe. I just, there's so much about it that I absolutely adore. But I kind of realized that like you can't, when something is a subjective media, like a film, you really can't prove someone wrong. You can't prove yourself right because it's always subjective. So what I try to do is it's just like sometimes like there are certain trolls that follow me for some reason and they're like, oh, you're wrong. And I'm like, well, look, this is what they said back in the day and this is what it is in the movie. You know, like you could disagree with it, but like here's how it is. I try not to get into ad hominem attacks because it where does it go? Like at that point, like,
well, at a point, it's probably going to become a zero-sum game, right?
Exactly.
Like, that's all it can go to.
Exactly. And it's like, I think there's something to be said about just like, we used to be, before Twitter, I mean, we used to have these debates in person all the time. Like, who trained Luke to do the Force pull or who trained him to do the lightsaber? Those are debates that we had, like, probably sitting around drinking a beer or, you know, playing a board game or playing Magic the Gathering. Like these are things that we talk about. It's just that on Twitter, when it becomes anonymous, it becomes volatile. So avoiding that sort of volatility helps. Also, I do admit to mocking them sometimes because like sometimes the arguments are just so stupid. So, yeah, but yeah.
So let's stick with positivity just for a moment.
Yeah.
And I'll bring this back around to the viewing order. So something that I like about the countdown, it's something that anyone can sort of jump into, right? Like anyone, if they're a small fan, a big fan, a true fan, they can. I know, right?
Oh God!
But anyone at any kind of level of fandom, any type of interest level, I mean, can get excited for a countdown, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about trying to keep kind of a positive voice, have you ever been responsible for bringing someone into the fandom that was not a part of it prior?
I would never. I don't think so. I don't think I've ever been like. I never brought someone into the fandom. I've definitely met a lot of people because of the countdown within the fandom. But I don't know. My girlfriend enjoys Star Wars. She doesn't love Star Wars, but she'll watch it, and I think she really likes Star Trek more, which I'm not going to complain about. Like, why would I complain about my girlfriend liking Star Trek? And she loves Farscape, and I'm like, she watched Doctor Who with me, so I'm not like gonna worry about it. But I think, I don't know. I don't think I've ever brought anyone into the fandom, but I definitely feel like my participation within the fandom has grown because of it. And I think I've met a lot of people like yourself who have deepened my love of the fandom and have deepened my appreciation for the films as well.
So let's pretend that you meet someone and they've not been involved in the fandom. They don't know anything about Star Wars. They've never even seen Star Wars. Now, you're not going to show them the fandom. You're not going to necessarily say, hey, you should jump on Star Wars Twitter, because that's really like the first stop for you.
Yeah.
But what you might do is you might sit them down and say, okay, well, let's watch Star Wars. Let's see if this is a thing for you. So if you're going to do that, would either of your viewing orders, would your preferred viewing order, would that be something that you would do with someone new?
That's actually a good question, because I've had this discussion in a lot of ways. What I really love about Star Wars in general, there's a lot of different ways you can enter. And I think how I would ask someone, like, I've never seen Star Wars before. I'm like, okay, what are your interests? What are you into? I know plenty of people who start with the prequels and they love the prequels and that's what they start with. I would necessarily say start with A New Hope because I think that's the best entry into the universe. However, I did know someone, one of my best friends, he is from Melbourne. His wife never saw Star Wars before. Her first Star Wars was The Force Awakens and she loved it. I think what's great about Star Wars, like if you're really interested in like how a government falls, Phantom Menace might be a really interesting way to start. If you just want to go classic, you can start with A New Hope. If you're just like, look, I need my special effects to be a certain standard, you start with The Force Awakens. You're really into animation, maybe start with Clone Wars or Rebels. I feel like there's so many ways for you to become a Star Wars fan that there's no specific order that you desperately need to introduce someone to it. You just have to find out what their interests are. But I typically lean on A New Hope as the best way to start.
One point that I'm going to jump into that you've raised there, and I think it's a really good one, is especially after Celebration and seeing kind of the quite vast age gaps between people that were there. Yeah. And meeting people and chatting to them and getting a bit of a feel for what their Star Wars is. Because everyone's got their Star Wars. Yeah. And typically I tend to find it either gets thought of in sets like the trilogy. Mm-hmm. So it's like my Star Wars is the original trilogy. My Star Wars is the prequel trilogy. Yeah. So that tends to be the terminology that gets thrown around quite a bit. But I met more and more people that said, no, my Star Wars is the Clone Wars animated series, and my Star Wars is now Rebels or whatever it may be. And certainly now it's put a slightly different lens in front of me when I think about things like this. When I think about the viewing order and how I would introduce someone to something, all of these people, like 30,000 people in a room, potentially with completely different ways of coming into the saga. I mean, obviously a lot of us with A New Hope, but doesn't mean that the understanding or the appreciation is really any different at the end of the day. So if we can all come to the same point, potentially having started somewhere else, then it's kind of given me a bit of fuel and given, I think, a few of us a bit of fuel to rethink the viewing order and maybe not be as, I don't know, as dogmatic with it. It tends to be something that has been very much about absolutes. You must start with the original trilogy and no other way. Why do you think that that's something that's just been inherited, by the fandom?
My own watch order, in comparison, is fairly basic. Start with episode 1 and go through every movie in chronological order until you run out of stories. However, to fill in some blanks, we add the Maul episodes of The Clone Wars and Rebels, and this helps to explain his appearance in Solo, and also they're a fantastic story about madness, revenge, and the pointlessness of living for hatred. A further addition is the holiday special, because you can't have the sweet without the sour.
Wow! You know what I mean?
And Battlefront 2, which helps to bridge the gaps between The Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. The main criticism of this watch order is that it ruins the Darth Vader reveal. But come on, at this point that is barely a reveal for anyone.
Search your feelings, you know it to be true.
I think a lot of people are dogmatic on the Vader reveal. And as the canon grows and grows, it's going to be less about Vader and more about this galaxy. There's going to be a whole host of people whose first Star Wars is going to be coming out in 2022. That'll be their entry point. That has nothing to do with the Skywalker saga. We have no idea what that's going to be like, but if it's Rian Johnson's trilogy, it could be thousands of years in the future or past. We don't know. I have a friend of mine who works for Del Rey, and one thing we were talking about after The Mandalorian came out, I asked, what are you most excited about? She's like, The Mandalorian. Not that she's not excited for The Rise of Skywalker, but The Mandalorian is the first sort of realization of the potential of the expanded universe that we knew as kids growing up with the novels. And I think that, we were dogmatic because we only had really these 6 movies or these now the 9 movies, or even the ancillary Rogue One and Solo were tied into the main 9 film saga. So I think, and Clone Wars and Rebels are all tied into the main Star Wars saga, and Resistance as well. I think what's going to be really interesting moving forward is that very soon where you start with Star Wars could be thousands of years in the past. There's so many people even then. Back in the day, there are folks whose first Star Wars is the Thrawn trilogy, or theirs was the Tales of the Jedi. There's so many different ways for you to enter. And I think my friend Patrick Willems, who is a YouTuber and just a really intelligent
amazing YouTuber.
I'm jealous of him. Every time he does a video, I'm like, I hate you for doing something so cool. But he mentioned in one of his videos that we're going to start measuring Star Wars in terms of eras. When Rey owned the Falcon and when Han owned the Falcon. And that's very exciting. I think that's actually goes down to what I love about Star Wars in general is this idea that there's this generational aspect to it. There's this legacy aspect to it that, whereas the MCU, which I very much enjoy, for the most part, is a linear narrative from Iron Man forward, or measurement, it's either before or after I am Iron Man. That's always that one line. You might get spin-offs like Guardians of the Galaxy, but it's still tied into Iron Man, I am Iron Man. What's great about Star Wars is that even before these new movies that are coming out in a few years and The Mandalorian, is that there was baked into it this larger universe, that we were always getting this one snapshot of this galaxy. So I think what's going to be really exciting is seeing The Mandalorian and hey, this is yes, this is set between Return of the Jedi and Force Awakens, but now we have this whole idea of what the galaxy was like, and there's I would qualify him as a frenemy here at my office who, his interest is he wants to see The Mandalorian because he likes the bounty hunters. That's something that he's always been excited about. And I think to your point earlier was that when I realized the celebration, and even a couple of weeks before at a wedding where I met this 12-year-old kid who's my favorite Star Wars is the Clone Wars and the prequels, is that there's no longer where the trolls say Star Wars ended with episode 6 or whatever, or episode 7. They're measuring Star Wars in a very finite sort of way. But that same group of people point to the expanded universe as what was the best version of Star Wars. And, it's sort of this weird sort of, not conflict of interest. They're sort of they're defying themselves or proving themselves wrong, because like there is no measurement of what a Star Wars fan is. It's either the films or the books, or it's now the audio dramas. There's all these different ways for you to be a Star Wars fan and enter Star Wars, because baked into the core concept of this series is a larger universe.
Oh, when was it? It was maybe 2 months ago. We at home rewatched all of the Harry Potter films, and then going and watching the Grindelwald films. After that, I was kind of struck by, I was like, so here's where you take something that is a linear universe, and now when they try to expand it, you see the cracks. You see where it was never meant to be, because now there's all this kind of retrofitting that's going on. And the whole what's the word? Like the whole ecosystem of Harry Potter kind of suffers because of it. And you're right. So Star Wars has always, let's say, apart from A New Hope, had that broader, larger outlook of world building that's been built into it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you could say, like in the prequels, that the things like characters and their acting and dialogue maybe suffered because there was so much going on with world building. But without any of that, we probably wouldn't have as much of a rich kind of tapestry that we could sort of tap into.
And what's interesting though, like, and this is just more from a just an understanding of how this world was built. Like, so much of what we define as this larger universe of Star Wars was defined by the West End games, like the old role-playing games from like 1988, I think it was. And it's one of those weird things that we have to remember that right now I'm reading the making of Star Wars trilogy books, and which are just really elucidating in terms of understanding how decisions were made, how, like some of the weird differences from different drafts. The fact that like Luke and Leia weren't originally siblings, things like that. But so much of what that world was ill-defined. It wasn't until the West End games that they said like, oh, let's name that guy in the background, or let's name that creature in the background. The fact that like, Lucas refers to a lightsaber as a laser sword throughout the entire all the productions numerous times, sort of helps highlight the fact that like what Lucas did was build a world that felt lived in and felt larger than what we see on screen. Not a lot has to do with Joe Johnston, Ralph McQuarrie, and a lot of the folks in there, but Lucas had the idea of making it bigger, of making everything just a little bit, not just what you see in the foreground, but there's some more stuff going on in the background that makes you want to see like, oh, what is that guy's story? But a lot of that didn't come out until really the West End games, when they're like, all right, this species is called a Weequay. Like, that's where it comes from. I mean, or not that specific example, but
there was the old EU. We know what's happened with the old EU. Don't need to retread that. But now we've got, as you've said, you've got comics, we've got TV shows, movies, books, audio dramas. Like there is, as quite rightly pointed out, there are so many different ways that you could enjoy Star Wars. So as you've been going through some of these other items, have you picked out any that you've thought to yourself, it's like, you know what, that particular bit has actually made me appreciate Attack of the Clones more, or given me some better depth to one of the characters in even the original trilogy?
I've always been a fan of the novels. Back like I own every expanded universe book with some exceptions. I'm missing some Young Jedi Knights books, which I need to correct. But I really like what Del Rey and Disney Publishing has been doing with the novels as of late. I think one of the biggest things with the EU, not to put too fine a point in it, is that everything had to be dialed to 11. Everything was the end of the world to the point that if nothing was. I mean, they had to escalate to the point of get the use on Vong, and you had, the Legacy of the Force, and and some other series which I haven't had a chance to dive too deep on. But what I really enjoy about the new Del Rey novels is that it's sort of they dial everything to about a 5 and sort of give the sort of background storyline. I think of some major events that are mentioned in the films but never really delved into, like Bloodline by Claudia Gray. Actually, anything by Claudia Gray is amazing.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Agreed.
It's just they're always good. Like even Master and Apprentice, which just came out recently, gave a lot of insight into who Qui-Gon was and sort of helps set up what I think most of the novels, Master and Apprentice as a perfect example, is that they help set up these characters in a way that feels it doesn't try to like make everything like a fan fiction of like here's all like the person they loved and like you'd never heard about this thing and like, oh, there's this weird shipping. It's more like, let us explain why Qui-Gon is so ready to believe in the Chosen One prophecy. Yeah. Or you have like Phasma by Delia Dawson. It's just giving a little more background on who Phasma was. You also have a few other novels like Kevin Scott's recent audio drama, Dooku Jedi Lost, which helps sort of give an understanding of why Dooku left the Jedi Order. So that's not one specific answer, but it's a good example of what the new canon is doing that I really enjoy. That just sort of like helps deepen these characters and deepen this world while not being forced to try to make every story the most important story ever. I think that was one of as much as, again, I love the EU, despite what some people apparently think of me on Twitter, like I loved it. But at the same time, like how many times did the world almost end? Like you look at the Black Fleet Crisis, which is basically an alien invasion, and then the next story is the Yuuzhan Vong series, which is another alien invasion. So it's like
it's constant one-upsmanship.
Exactly, and but they were all sort of chasing like the Thrawn trilogy in a way. But
if you had to say, okay, we're going to go chronological, watch everything right up until The Rise of Skywalker comes out, is there anything in the canon that's not the film? Let's call it like 2 or 3 things. Are there any of those things that you just would say, you know what, that if it was a movie would be in the viewing order, and so because it's not, I'm going to absolutely wedge it right in there, and it's going to become a must read, must watch, must listen, whatever it may be? I
think right now, especially with Palpatine coming back, which
he's coming back.
I know. Well, I think with one thing that it just, and this is going to answer your question in a little bit of a long way, but I was always kind of curious how they're going to make this a 9-film saga. Like, how do you connect it all? And one thing I loved about The Last Jedi was that it sort of wiped the slate clean at the end and allowed Episode 9 to be its own thing. But at the same time, like, what do you do? What's the next thing that like helps it bring it all together in a way that feels natural? Like for me, it was like let them go back to other places like Coruscant and Naboo and Tatooine to sort of like tie things together. But upon reflection, I think that, having Palpatine be the main villain for 9 films, because he is the main villain for at least 6 films out of the 9, now 7 out of the 9, that sort of makes sense. So to answer your question, I think that any Clone Wars episode or Rebels episode that has something to do, or even a novel that has something to do with Palpatine, might help sort of streamline that story. Because that way you can see how he's like this sort of Sauron villain of the Star Wars galaxy.
That's something actually Rebels. So the last couple of episodes of Rebels really did paint Palpatine in that kind of way. Like seeing that kind of interdimensional kind of play that he was going for. Yeah. And the way that the way that he's trying to kind of toy with Ezra and get what he wants from him. Actually reminded me a lot of when you look at sort of World War II fiction, and there's always the Nazis are trying to find some kind of supernatural thing so that they can take over the world. When I was watching those episodes of Rebels, that really just kept popping into my head. I was like, I think I've played a Wolfenstein story like this. So we've in our watch order, so we've gone chronological, and we've thrown in actually the Maul episodes. Yeah, and there's quite a few Maul episodes that do involve Palpatine, particularly when I think it's towards the end there where you've got Maul and Savage Opress that actually get into a bit of a brawl with Palpatine in there, and you do get to see that side of him kind of almost at full power there, which you don't really get to see him like that in any of the other material, at least on screen. You see him fighting Yoda, and that's pretty cool. But those episodes, they were really striking. What did you think of them?
I think what's been interesting about Clone Wars and Rebels in general is that they've really underlined this idea of him being this master manipulator, someone that can work behind the scenes and is so incredibly powerful that you remember with Revenge of the Sith when he's like, you don't realize how powerful he is until then. Though I still have issues with the makeup in that movie. I think that it just looks so weird when they melted his face.
It is Mr. Prune.
So that doesn't really answer your question, but I do remember those episodes to being very. I think what I liked about Rebels and Clone Wars is that they made him Palpatine terrifying in a way that I'm not exactly sure that he was in the original trilogy or even the prequel trilogy.
Yeah, I'd absolutely pay that one. I mean, if you think so episode 1, he's a senator. There's nothing much else going on. He's also the looming figure. And something that strikes me is that, there are a lot of people that didn't know that. And I think it's something that you take for granted as an original trilogy and an EU fan. Or, it didn't really take much. All you had to do was probably play one or two of the older video games even, and you would pick up the fact that was a guy named Palpatine. Yeah. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, here's Senator Palpatine. You're like, I know who that is. I know who that is. A lot of people don't. A lot of people didn't know that. And so watching his journey, potentially that's even a bigger reveal than the Vader twist. Because I would say Vader is a twist rather than a big reveal because there's not really any build up.
Also, I think that's something that we need to, just speaking of Palpatine, is the fact that he was based on Richard Nixon. Let's never forget that. He is in every single version, if you look at any, how many times Lucas talks about Palpatine in relation to Richard Nixon. So I really hope that they just do a little bit of that where he's
he does a bit of a boss nass.
Exactly.
Kind of thing. Yeah. Well, he's from Naboo, right?
Yeah, he is, exactly.
Yeah. Adam, I think we're out of time, but I wanted to thank you very, very much for joining me.
My absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, and we'll keep in touch on Twitter, and we'll keep that countdown going.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
The reveal of Luke's parentage is as ingrained in the zeitgeist as knowing that Bruce Willis is dead at the end of The Sixth Sense, or that Rosebud was Charles Kane's sled.
And there's the Kane from Citizen Kane.
How important is the reveal by today's standards? It's a question worth asking yourself honestly. In the rare occasion of finding a first-time viewer completely in the dark, watching the original trilogy first will preserve the sudden twist, but perhaps watching them in episode order creates a richer overall experience. My nephew watched all the movies in chronological order for the first time when he was 6 years old. His favourite part of the movies was watching Anakin turn into Vader. He lost the Empire twist, but he gained a longer narrative about a small boy who was rescued from slavery and became the scourge of the galaxy. So in the end, it's up to you. Long-form descent into darkness, or the Dad Vader twist? And remember, there's no wrong answer. Thanks for watching, and make sure you subscribe for more on the road to 9. Hit the bell icon so you're notified about future installments, and if you like what we do, you can support us by heading over to our Patreon and contributing. Even a small amount helps keep us producing content now and into the future.
Adam Lance, because I'll make a joke of this, but there's an Australian actor named Adam Garcia who looks just enough like me that people get us confused. I have a lot of fans in the Philippines.